right. Ready?
Guess so.
Now I will mute.
Try not to make that face.
All right, folks, we're just going to wait a little bit longer for people to trickle in, and then we'll get started. All right, good evening and welcome to tonight's live author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Shanae and I'm thrilled to host tonight's event with James Hannaham, launching his new book, Pilot Impostor. He will be talking with Susan Briante, so you're in for a great time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to James, Susan, and the team at Soft School Press for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Just a couple of housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple of ways you can interact with the authors and each other throughout tonight's event. The first is in the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon, and you're welcome to post your comments and thoughts there. The second is the Q&A module, where you're welcome to put any questions that you have for our authors tonight. We'll only be taking questions from the module, so make sure to put them there. Tonight's featured book, Pilot Impostor, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore in person at Fulton Street or Flatbush Ave from 10 a.m. to 7, or actually it's 8 p.m. now. Or you can order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup or shipping anywhere in the US. I'll be dropping the buy link in the chat every so often, so you can check there. As thanks for attending tonight's virtual event, we're offering 10% off the featured book if you enter the code GreenlightEvents10 into the coupon discount section at the checkout. And lastly, James is stopping by our store to sign copies of the book, so you can get a signed or even personalized book by request while supplies last. Make sure to indicate your signed copy request in the order comments at checkout by midnight tonight, or you can look for signed copies when you visit the store. So our interviewer tonight is Susan Briante, the author most recently of Defacing the Monument, a series of essays on immigration, archives, aesthetics, and the state. Briante is also the author of 3 books of poetry and a professor of creative writing at the University of Arizona, where she also serves as the co-coordinator of the Southwest Field Studies and Writing Program. Susan will be speaking with our featured author, James Hannaham. James was born in the Bronx, grew up in Yonkers, and now lives in Brooklyn. His most recent novel, Delicious Foods, won the Penn Faulkner and Hurston Wright Legacy Awards. He was for many years a writer for The Village Voice and Salon, and is also a visual and performance artist. He teaches at the Pratt Institute. James's new book, Pilot Impostor, is a startling, shape-shifting book of prose and images that draws on unexpected pair of inspirations: the poetry of Fernando Pessoa and the history of air disasters, to investigate con men, identity politics, failures of leadership, and the privilege of ineptitude, the slave trade, and the nature of consciousness. James is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then I'll be talking with Susan and with all of you. So please take it away, James.
Hi, thanks everybody for coming out. I'm really terrible at solemnity, but I did want to make space to honor Greg Tate, who is a colleague of mine at The Voice and an incredible writer who gave a lot of people a lot of inspiration and intimidated the heck out of me when I was working at The Voice with just, I'm going to use one of my minutes as a minute of silence. So I'm just going to start by doing that. Greg is going to be one of the best ancestors ever, I have to say. Good. He already was as wise as any ancestor. And anyway, we honor him this evening. So enough of my solemnity, my rare, and I've already wasted one of the 5 minutes I've been allotted. So
I'm tacking on another minute by sheer chutzpah.
Okay. I thought I would just start out by reading one of the first pieces. I suppose I could spend the rest of the minutes explaining to you what this is, but I think it's probably easier to cover that in the talk afterward. And here's a photograph. Actually, it's a screen grab from a YouTube video, which is something I learned that you actually don't have to pay for in photo permissions if you use one. It's one of those weird loopholes, but it's probably going to close pretty soon. So go out there and grab those images from YouTube to make your strange books of images and poetry. All right. This is called Knife Magnet. What we see of things are the things, writes Cairo. But the city insisted otherwise. For example, our first night in Lisbon, we found a restaurant that stayed open until 2 a.m., making our first night a morning. While waiting, I moved the silverware and discovered that the handle of my knife attracted the fork. Using the knife, I dragged the fork in a circle on the table. I saw a knife and I saw a magnet. Which thing of the thing did I see? I saw a magnet and I saw a knife. What I saw of the thing had no thing of the thing in it. If you could ask the thing, what would the thing say? Would it use some word known only to things like itself? I've seen that. I've seen myself as several things when someone else saw only one, and I used a word unknown to those outside. Maybe I saw my reflection in the silvery surface. What we see of ourselves is not us. Is what we see of things ourselves? That sets a lot of the sort of pace of things to come. And then, let's see, what's another? Oh, here's a somewhat representative piece. It's called Air Disaster. A plane crashed under mysterious circumstances in a country with a dense, sparsely populated rainforest. None of the passengers or crew survived. Because of the nature of the accident, many parts of the plane had scattered over a wide area, which made this difficult investigation almost impossible. People from nearby villages walked away with parts of the plane they thought might be useful as tools or to trade. The small country did not have a good transportation safety board. They needed to send the many charred parts of the fuselage to the United States for analysis. After getting word to the local populace that they would pay a reward for the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, and providing pictures of both, officials recovered each of them. The boxes had sustained heavy fire damage. No one knew if they would yield any information. The investigators carefully packed the black boxes, which were orange, into crates and put them on an airplane to Washington, D.C. But the plane carrying the black boxes disappeared from radar while over the ocean en route to the United States. There followed an extremely time-consuming and costly search and rescue effort for the black boxes on board the second plane, as well as for those from the earlier crash. The search continued for months and cost millions of dollars. The governments conducting the search ran out of money twice and nearly gave up, but the families of those presumed dead insisted that the search continue and put pressure on the various governments involved. For a while, the press remained fixated on such an unusual story, but gradually, with so few developments, they lost interest. A year and a half into the search, investigators found the wreckage. The plane had sunk so far down that only a robotic submersible could explore the crash site. Alternatives existed, but their costs became prohibitive. Finally, after 5 years, the technology and budget came within reach, and the investigators recovered both flight data recorders and cockpit voice recorders. Everyone on the reconnaissance boat whooped with joy. That night, on the way back to shore, the boat caught fire and sank, killing all crew members. No one could ever properly investigate any of the mishaps. They all remain completely unexplained at the bottom of the ocean. That's what it's like to have to deal with you. How much more time do I have? Two more, or 2 minutes? Are you muted? You're muted.
Yeah.
You were just saying how you wanted to hear the dog coming through the. Oh, here's another photograph. That was actually, I think we couldn't locate the person who is responsible, but it's a sort of fake. It's a fake 9/11 photograph that was a meme for a while of like the guy. He appears to be standing on top of the trade towers and there's a plane coming, but that's photoshopped. But people thought it was real. All right, this is called In Twilight. This sickening canal retains a gruesome beauty. Today, the weather waxed psychotic, chilly and rainy in the morning, humid and dense as it grew hot, sunny for a second, and now the bluish gray of photographs of Eastern Europe flows from the train bridge into the sky. On the surface of the water, a cascade of soap scum tries to form a matte skin over the center of the stream. Concentric circles of metallic green, gold, violet, and blue slowly eddy below. These hues would seem festive on a wall somewhere, but instead, like real ones, they signal the funeral of whatever might have existed below, and the peril of any trustful heron who might accidentally sip from that deadly ditch, or even, like myself, merely belly up to it. Maybe droplets have already begun evaporating in this greenhouse atmosphere, flooding my nose, softly whispering to my cells their own poem. Cancer, cancer, cancer. Maybe one more. I was looking for a particular one that made me think, oh, this is a Susan Briante ripoff. Like, when did I rip Susan off the most? Let's see. Where is that one? There's no table of contents, so it's kind of hard to. How much more time do I have? Oh, this is Age of Discovery. Right? It's kind of a Susan Briante ripoff. Over time, what?
Page number.
51. I feel like we're in class. Are you reading along, kids? Over time, the continents seem to breathe, inhaling as they come together, exhaling as they move apart. In the age of European exploration, explorers did not visit many uninhabited places. Nobody discovered much of anything. They walked into a furnished apartment during a party and said, "Mine. Get out of my apartment, work for me at pitifully low wages, if any, or die." They discovered only a few small islands. Great is the power to ignore another. Portugal was one of the last locations in continental Europe to be populated by modern humans. Morocco is home to the oldest human remains on record, some 300,000 years old. And yet, at their closest points, Morocco and Portugal lie only 50 miles apart. The Lapedo child is perhaps the oldest remnant of Homo sapiens in Portugal. It dates from only 25,000 years ago. He is thought to have had one Homo neanderthalis parent and one Homo sapiens parent, a mixed race child. the mixed race child of two homos. Homo sapiens not only interbred with Neanderthals and in Eurasia, they also had sex with several species of our ancestors across the African continent, and they did it often. In 2017, João Gilhau found a 400,000-year-old fossilized Neanderthal skull in Portugal. Some parts of the planet have always been underwater. The oceans may have come from an underground reservoir 3 times the size of the oceans. Right?
I love it. I do wish we could hear a little more, and maybe I'll nudge you in that direction in the course of our conversation, because I think it's an amazing book. And it's an amazing book in part because of the so many things it does. But, and there's so much to talk about, but let's start at the beginning, which is the beginning of the project. So I know, why don't you tell us how it all began? You were on a plane. I'll set the stage.
Yeah, I was on a plane. It was my first trip to Africa. I mean, sort of. I mean, it seems a little like, since it wasn't a trip where we were going to the continent itself, it was to Cape Verde, which is off the coast. It didn't feel as momentous. It didn't feel that, I mean, that thing that Black writers are supposed to feel when they go to Africa, like, I'm home. This is, I mean, my relationship to it was a little different because my father was always going there and he was trying to start an import-export business for years and years, but the Africans would always cut him out of the deal, or so he said. Like, and some of these schemes were like kind of crazy sounding. Like, he was going to sell metal coffins in Ghana because he was like, in Ghana they bury you, and then people like try with your valuables, and like people dig your grave, and they try to steal all your valuables. So he thought, like, let's build these very it's
a coffin safe.
Yes, essentially. But I mean, people would still probably like run off with that. Anyway, that none of them ever really worked out, although he did have a lot of wooden sculptures, like wooden giraffes and stuff from Africa. So anyway, we were on our way back, actually, from Cape Verde. And I usually bring a representative work of literature to any country that I haven't been to before, and actually to some that I have. Or to sometimes it's to states. Like, I think I took like Death Comes to the Archbishop to New Mexico or something like that. Like, there's always some, how do I, what am I going to read while I'm on this trip? Anyway, we were going to be in Portugal for like 4 days on the back end of this trip. So I brought along this book, which is perhaps one of the more representative works of Portuguese poetry, certainly of the early 20th century. And Pessoa's project really interested me because it's very shape-shifty. He was sort of, I mean, I've been explaining it sort of this way, like he didn't feel there were enough Portuguese poets. So he decided he was going to invent about 70 of them and, create a kind of internal community that he referred to as heteronyms, because their life histories were all very different, and they knew each other and edited each other, and there was this whole it was like this little sort of mini play world or something in his mind, oddly. And it did remain mostly in his mind, because very little of his work was published in his lifetime. Like, there's only one full volume, and that's really problematic, partially because it was sort of sanctioned by the Estado Novo, which that's not really a very, like, I wouldn't be proud of that. And so I was on this plane, and it was right after, who became the president of what in 2016. It was December of 2016, so it was very fresh. And I was thinking about, as many people were thinking about, what happens when, somebody who has no experience doing a job is, becomes the leader of the country.
Free world.
Yeah, or the so-called free
The
world.
so-called free world.
That's very expensive somehow. And so I was thinking, because I was on a plane and feeling vulnerable the way you do when you're on an airplane, like, at any minute something could go wrong and you have no idea. Usually, like, the average person would have no idea what was going wrong or how to do anything about it.
And no control, right?
No control
there's
at
no
all.
Intervention, right?
Right, and usually you haven't even seen the person flying the plane, so it's very, like, there's this very mysterious trust that happens while you're flying. And I think some comedians had already made a joke about, like, electing that guy president was like, what if you chose your plumber that way? Like, I want a guy who's not a plumber to be my plumber. Like, what do you think's gonna happen? And I thought the same thing about, pilots. And then I opened the book, and the first line of the book is basically, my interpretation of this line, I should say, was very particular because of the mindset I was
Context.
in. Yeah. Wait, are you asking for context?
No, I said because of the context.
You're finishing my sentence. Okay.
Sorry.
But the first line of the book is, I've never kept sheep, but it's as if I did. Which, is not exactly lying on your resume, the way it sounds, because it was ostensibly written by a heteronym called Alberto Cairo, who I mentioned in that first piece that I read, who's kind of it's hard to describe. I see him as a kind of anti-poetic poet, like a mystic, non-mystic, whose view of the world is that surfaces are all there is, essentially. Like, things, what we see of things are the things, like there isn't anything behind it.
Right.
Yeah. And that, to me, also, at reading a little bit further, that also sounded a little bit like something a totalitarian government would love to, promulgate, right? Like, everything is as it seems. There's no subtext. There's nothing under the surface. There's no one behind the curtain. It's all above board. And so that started to infuriate me as well. By the end of the plane ride, I was like, yeah. I felt like, I want to respond to every last one of these poems. And then it was one of those things where, you have your like $10,000 idea of the day, right? Mm-hmm. Like, this will make, I'll start a business that does this. So it was sort of similar to that, in my first inspiration for it. But then something weird happened where we were renting a car and we went to the car dealership, the rental car.
Rental, yeah.
Yeah. And the woman behind the counter had a nameplate on that said Pessoa. And so I was like, oh. And I was like, well, it's probably like, the Smith or Jones of Portugal, right? So I was like, hey, is that a common name? And she said, no. And then so I took the opportunity to get into a little conversation with her about Pessoa, and I showed her the book, and she was like, I don't know if I'm related to him, but I love his work. So, and then, I guess I was seeing that as a sign of some kind. And so I created a sort of daily, not totally daily, but like semi-regular practice of reading one of the poems in the book and then kind of thinking about how I would want to respond to it if I were to sort of answer it, or just, think about some of what it is about and turn it to my own concerns. And strangely enough, I did do that. Like, I went all the way through and did good.
And I guess that's like, that to me is part of the question I wanted to get to is like, have you thought about, because I love the how you framed it as like it was my like, $10 million idea. Like, I think as writers, we often do like to come up with what are these what's this little game? What's this prompt I'm going to give myself? But like, there's a lot of them that we like, that worked for 5 poems, or it worked for one chunk of writing. And then so what was it about this particular process what sustained you in this process? Or was there something in Pessoa's work itself? What kept you going in it?
Well, I used to be more in a performance. I was in a performance group for a long time, and I've done a whole lot of different types of writing, from like, reviewing music and theater to, I did a couple of shameful bits of info, what do they call that? Like
infomercial?
Advertorial.
Advocation?
Yeah,
education?
It was, there was not very much of it, but it was a pretty low point in my writing career, I think. So one of the things I really liked and identified with was this idea of, the fragmented self writing, different types of writing, as, like each of the heteronyms seems like a different sort of performance by Pessoa, who, started to claim that he didn't exist. It was like this really, he takes it to a level that gets a little silly and a little annoying sometimes, but like, he just was committed to this idea that, they were in some ways separate from himself. And I think a lot of critics tend to take that a little more seriously than maybe I would, knowing, what the game is essentially. And what else, I guess, I think it was just that the book was around, and I would pick it up, and I was reading it as I was doing this. It wasn't as if I read the whole thing and then
went back.
Let me go back and do this. And then it started to take on like really interesting properties. Sometimes I would be sort of, I had questions about what was going on in the original that I would have to go find the original Portuguese to like, see if a poem had been written as a rhyming poem, as opposed to translated as a poem that did not rhyme. Because sometimes I'd be like, I'll bet this was a different sort of thing when it was originally written.
And then did that influence your response? Like, were you thinking about the form of the original as one characteristic that might also prompt the way that you were responding?
Yes. And there were, I'm not sure I could point out examples exactly of that, but I think it's happening all the time.
Yeah.
And there are some that are just, a phrase in one of the poems would sort of confuse or interest me in some way, and that might grow into something like a mold.
A productive petri dish of possibilities.
Yeah, and then there were some instances where, just the frustration of like forcing myself to do something would I'd end up doing something really strange. Like there's a poem that was written with my autofill, with the autofill on my phone. Actually, there was a reviewer who said that poem sounded like it had been written with the autofill from a phone, and I was like, well, actually. But that was like, it was like a complaint that was what I'd done. I was like, what? You just can't imagine that someone would do that?
Is it possible that in some ways, like just the variety of process, I mean, it sounds like you were coming up with different process to approach every piece
right.
of writing, is that maybe part of what kept it going for you, or the excitement, or?
Yeah, at a certain point, I determined that I wasn't going to make a decision about what genre. I mean, we were talking about genre in private before, but like I decided that I would just, because of all the experience I had in writing different types of things, and in switching my voice around in the process of that, I thought I would also just like do away with the notion that the whole thing had to be the same, and like I sort of give in to Pessoa's impulse that everything had to be different. Like, so I'm sure that you could find things that fit into the same category, but I was not necessarily self-consciously thinking that every new one had to be something different, but it just, I was letting myself be open to whatever idea came to me that felt like there was some juice there, some action, and then writing something. And then, since it's an anthology, I wrote a lot of stuff with the intention that I was going to remove most of it. And so some of it is just some of them are throwaways, and some of the throwaways I thought were like funny or surprising enough that I was like, somebody else ought to see this. So
I guess I have like 4 other questions, and I'm trying to figure out which one comes. Well, so did you learn something in writing this book? Like, did writing in this, like, in a kind of form and with a kind of process, teach you something about writing that you didn't know before? Or is that a dumb question, because no matter what we're writing and whenever we're writing a new project, we're learning something? No question's a dumb question, but you know what I mean.
Well, I was going to say I learned a lot about Pessoa.
Yeah.
I mean, I certainly couldn't have told you everything that I said about him earlier at the at the beginning. And there are ways in which he's sort of the perfect like poet to rediscover, because his work, he was doing something that at the time was very unusual, but became more of a concern for artists in the end of the 20th century.
Right.
But it had all been sitting at home in a trunk, and nobody had been able to like even assemble it into anything until some editors came along and decided that it was worthwhile. And his ostensible masterpiece, the Book of Disquiet, really just consists of like a ton of scraps of paper that are, some of them are attributed and some of them are not, to like various, it's just like a huge mess of thousands and thousands of scraps of paper in a box and in a trunk that was just left behind. And so like, people can come after him and do anything they want to it. And I suppose there's my thinking about identity with regard to that fact that he was somebody who was claiming not to exist, who had left all of this undifferentiated material that's supposedly attributed to all these other people. It was like I think I started to learn something about how my own thinking about identity as I wrote it, because at the beginning the book was kind of about bad leadership, and then at a certain point it shifted to be about one's own inability to lead one's own self through life in a body, or like what are the difficulties of that, and how do we know, from like fake news to what is real, is basically the trajectory that I took through the book, because like it just became a larger question while going through all of this material.
There's a moment in one of the poems, is it that poem Conch, where
What
where
page?
I feel like I think it's 50.
Oh yeah.
For those of you who are reading a lot, where there's a quote from Pessoa that's like, or there's like you're talking about Pessoa in such a way that's he writes to read himself, he writes to hear himself. And I think it's before that. For Pessoa or whoever he happens to be at the moment, probably Reese, only perception exists. And I thought that was really interesting too, as a way of thinking about writing and identity, that like, what if we loosened ourselves from identity, if that's possible, or at least from what identities are projected upon us, what do we gain as writers? And I wondered if
as people, for that matter,
or people, yeah, or human beings, yeah.
Yeah, who knew? Is that a question?
I mean, it's just an observation that seemed to be like underneath some of the stuff. The question that maybe I could follow it up with is, it's like, I do notice while this book is really different formally than your other work, like I think back to God Says No, which also has someone like leaving their identity behind, at least for a moment, so that there is, maybe you can say a little bit more about your own relationship to identity and how that connects to this work, to that work. Say whatever you want.
That's one of those like large questions. I mean, I think what some of this book is about is just a sort of expansion of the way that we think about identity. Because, identity, when people say identity these days, it always seems to mean like culture and skin color and these things that are actually, not even close to the sum of what a person is or how a person thinks, and sometimes feel even sort of more distant from, the actual lived experience of a human being than you would imagine. I mean, or that other or that people projecting onto you would imagine, right? Like, it's weird enough just to be a person with a consciousness in a body, and then to have people project all kinds of,
ideas, expectations,
just based on what you look like.
Yeah.
Or for you to do the opposite, or for you to do the same to other people who seem to be part of whatever group it is that you identify with. But it's always seemed to me a little inadequate to describe people in such terms. I also feel like a lot of other writers are doing that. And I have a tendency to zag when other people zig. That's just.
I think one of the things that's really exciting about the book, it's interesting in a lot of the interviews and descriptions, the words identity politics come up. And I have to say, as like, wanting to consider herself a woke, white, ethnic woman, a lot of times when I hear identity politics, it's the critique coming from the other side, like the critique that says, oh, we were always just using your identity, we're all the same. And like, I want to push that critique aside, but I think there's another sort of critique that you're suggesting, which is more just about nuance and how we think about ourselves.
Yeah, I'm not saying like identity
doesn't
politics.
Matter.
No, I'm very aware of how useful they are in the political sphere.
Yeah.
I just think like there's no way that can be the whole story. And then maybe if we start looking at, making it more complex, we might get somewhere, right? Because it is the part that we have in common, more or less, right? Or supposedly, but do we really even know?
Because we're trapped in our own perceptions in these one singular bodies.
Right.
Deep. It's really, I find it really charming that you talk about yourself as not wanting to be serious, but like so much of this book is really about many serious things, not the least of all are airplane disasters, which like, again, also to me harkens back to it's it's a train crash. That's the disaster that provokes an identity
Right. Yeah.
change. Yeah.
Yeah. I just repeat myself. That's all I do.
No. I mean more like.
No, I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid to repeat myself. That's what I'm saying.
Am I repeating myself? Don't make me. No, but I do wonder if it's like an impulse to respond to like the continual crisis or unfolding disaster that we've sort of been in some ways, or
yeah, I mean, it's that, and it's also like my experience as, you know, a person in what I sometimes call my black man costume, you know, where I'm in here and I know what's going on, and sometimes people respond to it in ways that have nothing to do with what's going on inside. Yeah. And I'm perpetually confused by that. I mean, sometimes people think I'm like heterosexual, and that's weird. I mean, sometimes like women give me strange looks on the street as if they think I'm going to like do something or say something. And I'm like, honey, you don't even know. Well, I mean, that's just one example of the ways in which, like, I mean, it's one of the sort of the least dangerous situations, actually, that one could get into in your black man costume.
Exactly.
Walking out into the street, right? Like, so I think it's something that never really leaves my mind. But I'm not, wait, I'll figure out a different way to say whatever it is I was about to say that I can't remember now.
Oh, okay. I was like, say it however you want, but
the air disasters thing was actually because of an obsession I had with a television show called Air Disasters.
Air Disasters.
That has actually not so much to do with the, you know, the initial inspiration for the book. It just happened to be something that I was thinking about a lot. It's kind of a procedural. Have you ever seen the show?
I haven't, and having had bouts of airplane terror, of like really getting anxious on airplanes, I won't. This book is as close as I'm going to come to it. Thank you very much.
Yes, I know. I think I was a little bit like not realizing how upsetting it would be as a thematic thing to thread through. But the thing that was fascinating to me about the show was not just the dramatic, you know, stories. It was also that it's a procedural, so they kind of have to tell the same story over and over again, using different details so that it doesn't get stale. Right. And so the way that they wrangle information was really interesting to me. And I started to be able to learn to, like, I started to teach myself to read the episode, because, you know, there's stuff that they tell you at the beginning that, you know, points to things at the end, or like points to information they haven't given you yet. Like if they're interviewing somebody who survived, you're almost always likely to think like, oh, you know, there weren't that many casualties, but sometimes it's the only person. You know what I mean? So, and the other thing that I really loved about this show was that they're always trying to authentically recreate in their reenactments, like the groups of people who would be on the planes, right? So if they did a show about a plane crash in Asia, they would hire Asian actors to be, you know, the flight crew and the passengers, right? They would, if they did one on an African disaster, they would hire African or Black people. I mean, it looked like to me they were hiring more actors of color than like any other show I've ever seen, but without calling attention to it. Right. It was just a thing that they had to do in order to maintain authenticity. Yeah. So that was the thing that was also compelling to me about the show.
Yeah. And started to make its way into the responses to the poems at a certain point.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, a lot of the things in that piece that I read that ends with that's what it's like to deal with you.
with you.
A lot of it's a compilation, actually, a sort of a compendium, if you will, of a bunch of different true things that did happen, but just sort of turned into a salad of
Disaster.
of a factoid salad. It's
A
called.
disaster factoid
Yes,
salad.
a disaster factoid salad. This is like a Butthole Surfers album.
The new one. We have one question in the chat, which is related to genre, and I will share with you, but I'll also encourage folks in our audience to put any other questions that they have for James. So the question comes from Doug Stort, who writes, what is your relationship to poetry? If you had to stick a label on the book, what would you call it? Is it poetry, prose poetry, essay? Big Deb, oh, Big Deb must know, sorry.
I don't know who that is. If I had to put a label, but the fact is I don't have to.
And at some point, your press is going to say, "What? We're going to enter this into a contest."
That has actually already happened.
Of course.
And there were a bunch of these pieces were published in Plowshares in 2019, and they have a very strict like genre thing, where if they publish something, it has to be in one of the 4 categories, and they had a few of them, and I ended up putting each of them into a different category, essentially. And then I think it was the thing I've said about it is that it's multi-genre, but it's in the poetry space.
Well, I mean, that to me, one lovely way to think about genre is as something that is like activating a tradition, right? So there's a way in which this book is in conversation with a poetic tradition, which seems like a good way to describe it, whether or not we call it prose poetry or flash fiction,
right.
or fragments or whatever.
I mean, it's a shadow book of a book of poetry.
Yeah.
And in fact, I don't know if I mentioned this, but even though I've removed most of the material and I replaced almost anything, one of the many crazy rules I had while drafting was that if I removed a piece, I would replace it with an image. But the order in which the poems, or the pieces, I should say, of my own work and this book are such that you can follow along if you have both, which you don't.
One of the reviewers compared it to Exile, the relationship between Liz Phair's Exile and Guyville and Exile on Main Street, and I thought that seemed like maybe an appropriate analogy. It's not quite song for song, but
it is a similar approach. Yeah.
Have you go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, has this experience worked its way into the classroom at all? Have you always asked your students to respond to work? Do you ask them to respond to work now? Are you more of a prompt master, or have you always been someone who gives prompts in class?
I try to make them as open-ended as possible. I think what happens when I give students work to respond to, I think they almost always want to know what the parameters are, and I find myself saying, just use it in whatever way you feel like using it. And I think that's a similar, like if you hate it, like use that.
Respond,
right, just respond. It doesn't have to have something specifically to do with what I've given you to respond to. You don't have to like tie it really neatly to the thing, just like, what does this do and what does it make you want to do, even if that's like I have a performance piece where I tear this piece, I tear the
Yeah.
pages up or whatever. You know what I mean? Like I feel like sometimes they don't know how crazy they can get and still have me be like, yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and like I was thinking about, gosh, now see if I can remember what page this is on. Oh, it's it's Slavish rhythm.
Oh yeah, okay.
And then that was like one of the I like that particular piece. Now you're going to tell me what page it's on. Like that was one of the pieces that I was like, okay, I want to go back to the original. So like what's the how do I reverse engineer this? And I thought there was something really beautiful about the fact that it's sort of riffing off of a phrase and an idea, right? In a poem that the original poem is very different. I can't find the page.
Yeah, sorry. Whoops. Oops.
The poets would call you out for not a table of contents.
But yeah, actually that was one where I did, because that phrase in Richard Zenith's translation was slavish rhythm. I thought, let me make sure that this is something that's part of the original, and I'm pretty sure that it does translate as that. And I was like, well, what is that supposed to mean? Slavish rhythm. In
the context of all the other of the history that's the all here. Oh yeah, it's on page 38.
Yeah, I've seen it before.
For those in the audience who are following along. What was the process of and I will, because I think it's worth it, right? Like show folks, now I can't see myself, right? But like there's the poem and there's the image that follows. What was the process of making the images? How did you said that you came up with a rule in which if you were not using a poem, that you were going to put an image in as a replacement for whatever poems weren't going to be there. Did you have particular rules that you created for yourself for how these images were created?
Well, originally I was going to design the book as well, like as I wrote it.
Yeah.
Which gives you a sense of like how much I thought it would be published. Not at all. But eventually that started to become unfeasible because the file got too big, and the space that I'd like allotted for text had gotten small, and I wanted to write longer. So I abandoned that, but it was not for a while. I think I had like 60 or 70 pages of stuff that I had designed to go into this other book. So when it became more of a thing and it seemed like I had to remove things, the rule I made was that I would replace any piece that I cut with an image, and I had all of these images that were essentially the early design of the book. So that was one layer of editing. I think that was, and then like I think in subsequent layers, different categories of image replaced pieces. There are some that are error messages. I collect those. That's just kind of a side gig. Whenever I see some like error message that looks really like it might disappear from the world after a certain point, because these things that come up. Do you remember those? For example, do you remember those like people who used to, be in all the ads, and they would come right up to you and then they would move back, or like the dancing babies, like in sort of the internet things?
Do you remember the bomb that used to come on if you had an apple?
Oh yeah.
Old apples, like the error message was a bomb, which is kind of terrifying.
It would be super inappropriate now.
I mean, it was a cartoon, like it looked like like a bowling ball with a fuse. Still,
right.
It was.
Yeah, nobody thought anything was going to happen, but like these are different times. But yeah, so, and then there were some pieces, actually, I'm just happened to be open to one. There were some pieces that like, I kind of couldn't separate the design from the writing. And so I just
Right.
reproduced them, like this one. It's just, that's what it was when I wrote it.
Yeah.
And then there were some, just random images like that wonderful kissy neck pillow.
From your own collection?
No, that was off Amazon actually. And then there were some images that were too expensive once I realized that I was going to have to actually pay for permissions for some of the images that I was using. And so I just decided to draw them.
Interesting. We only have about 4 minutes left, and I wonder if you would be interested in like sending us out with one more short selection. I guess all the selections are relatively short.
Well, some of them are a little longer. What would that be?
Sorry to put you on the spot, but
here's something that I'll read it slowly so that we'll use up all of the time. Existence of existence. The detective finds a set of footprints leading toward the crime scene on the beach after the murder. He recognizes a certain pedal deformity in the footprint that suggests a peculiar injury to do with a bunion, which narrows the possible perpetrators down to one, himself. He does not recall committing the crime, yet he knows that no one else could have committed it. The detective sends DNA discovered at the crime scene to the laboratory, and when they have a profile, it proves identical to his own. Because he was adopted at a young age, he does not know that he has a criminal twin brother. The brother, however, is aware of the detective and keeps track of him, continually framing him for various crimes. The detective begins to believe that he has a split personality. Thought is the thought of thought, says Joyce. The detective knows who committed the crime, but he does not know that the perpetrator is a chimera, someone with two separate DNA profiles. Everything points to the perpetrator, but no DNA match occurs. The detective trusts the idea of DNA profiling so blindly that he does not realize that in certain cases he has worked on, technicians mishandled the samples and ended up sending innocent people to jail. Contamination goes unquestioned. The DNA of a homeless man and a millionaire wind up on the same oxygen mask on the same night. The authorities charge the homeless man with the murder of the millionaire. Guess how long he remains in prison. The taxi driver has a condition that causes him to shed skin cells at a high rate. One night, a woman who would be murdered later in the evening gets into his cab. Question: what strange phenomenon has prevented researchers from understanding consciousness? Answer: consciousness. It's a nice one to have. You take that away and be confused by it.
I think it's wonderful, and it points to all of the wonderful ways in which the book turns from the humorous to the quite philosophical and serious. It's
Don't forget the tragic.
And the tragic.
Disastrous.
And the disastrous. Yeah, it's a fantastic, fantastic book.
Thank you. I tried to rip you off as much as I could. I'm not totally unserious about that. I really do love your work.
Thank you so much.
It's been a huge influence on me.
I could never have written a book about airline disasters and race and identity and the perception and existence and kept
well,
it funny.
I wouldn't say that we're identical people or anything. I just admire some of the moves you make, most of the moves you make in your work.
Thank you.
And I'm like, yeah, that's how to be a poet.
Or someone who sides between genres, and who doesn't care. And I think
Right.
that,
but who gets lumped into poetry because that's
Yeah.
where most of the,
Yeah.
open-mindedness about that kind of thing is.
Yeah.
Whereas
I do think, I think the open-minded.
The fiction writers all think they're gonna, sell something to Netflix.
Oh, yeah, I guess that's true. I do think that there's open-minded experimentation in every genre. It's just that some genres have other folks that get a little more attention than some of the
Yes,
than some of the wild experimentalists.
Yeah. All right. Well, was that it? Oh, here we. Oh, there's the thing that says to buy it. Okay.
Yes, I just put it in. I wanted to say thank you and good night to everybody. Thank you so much, Susan, for being here, and James as well. Please buy Pilot Impostor at Greenlight Bookstore, either online or in store.
Beautiful.
It's really lovely. You got to see a lot of it, but there's a lot you didn't get to see, so check it out. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night. Was there anything else y'all wanted to say before we end tonight?
No, just thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Greenlight Bookstore, and thank you, everyone, for your attention.
Cool. All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night.